What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Mana Fix and the next deck tech in our Commander deck tech series. Infect is a sore topic for some. Some find it to be unfair in Commander because they see it as lowering their life total from 40 to 10. Personally, I'm okay with people playing Infect in Commander. Aggro strategies are automatically at a disadvantage due to the higher life totals in our format, and I feel that Infect is one of the only avenues to creating a successful aggro deck. So that's exactly what we've built for today's deck tech. I built this deck on a budget, so it's costing us less than $90 to put this together. And now to introduce our commander. New from Kaldheim, it's Fynn the Fangbearer. Fynn is a legendary human warrior for 1 green and 1 other. He's a 1/3 with Deathtouch, and he says whenever a creature you control with Deathtouch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters. Now, our version of this deck probably isn't what you think it is. Nope. Just kidding, it's exactly what you think it is. We're going to smash our opponent's faces with Deathtouch creatures so they die of poison counters. Cool, let's get into it. We'll start with the Deathtouch and Infect creatures in the deck. We've got quite a few cheap 1 or 2 drop Deathtouchers in the deck like Sedge Scorpion, Tajuru Blightblade, Moss Viper, and Deadly Recluse. To add to that list, we also have Thornweld Archer, Gnarlwood Dryad, Heir of the Wilds, and Narnum Renegade. These cards don't really serve much purpose other than being cheap Deathtouch creatures to capitalize on our commander's combat damage trigger. However, we do have other creatures that offer a little more value. One example of this would be Ambush Viper. This is a 2-drop 2/1 with Deathtouch, but it also has Flash. This allows us to use it as a removal spell if we need it. If someone swings a problematic creature in our direction, we can flash in our Ambush Viper to block and kill that creature. Turntimber Basilisk can also remove creatures. This is a 2/1 with Deathtouch that also has a landfall ability. When this triggers, we can force an opponent's creature to block Turntimber Basilisk and kill it. Occam Adversary is a 2/3 with Deathtouch that draws us a card whenever it deals damage to a player. Wasteland Viper is neat because it has Deathtouch itself, but it can also be discarded for 1 green mana to give a creature we control Deathtouch until end of turn. So we might be able to surprise one of our opponents with that ability. Now, not all of our creatures have Deathtouch automatically, so these next few cards can give those creatures the ability we crave. Nightshade Peddler is a 2-mana 1/1. He has Deathtouch himself, but he can also soul bond with a creature to give that creature Deathtouch, which is really helpful. And then Gorgon Flail and Gorgon's Head are equipment cards that give the equipped creature Deathtouch. The only difference between the two is that the Flail gives the equipped creature +1/+1, but it also costs 1 more to cast. Nylea's Bow is another card that gives our creatures Deathtouch. It's a 3-mana legendary enchantment artifact that gives attacking creatures we control Deathtouch. It also has an activated ability that can do a few things, but those things are more or less irrelevant. The next Deathtoucher on the list is Crystalline Giant. So he technically doesn't have Deathtouch, but as soon as you hit the combat phase on the turn he comes out, you can give him a Deathtouch counter. Then on the following turn, you can give him another ability like Flying or Hexproof or Lifelink. This creature has a lot of flexibility, which makes him a great creature to have on the battlefield. Probably the best Deathtouch creature in the deck, though, is Hornet Queen. Hornet Queen has Deathtouch and Flying, and she creates 4 1/1s with Deathtouch and Flying when she enters. If we're allowed to untap with all of those creatures on the battlefield, there's a really good chance we can knock someone out of the game at that point, since we can dish out 2 poison counters with each of those creatures. The other card that can create Deathtouch tokens is Hornet Nest. This is a 0/2 with Defender. Whenever damage is dealt to this creature, it creates that many 1/1 insect tokens with Deathtouch and Flying. Obviously, this is a great blocker because we can throw it in front of a big creature and create a bunch of Deathtouch tokens. However, our opponents aren't usually going to let us get off that easily. But we do have a few cards in the deck that allow our creatures to fight it, meaning we don't need to rely on our opponents to get this card to trigger. Every commander deck needs ramp, but for this deck, we're going to primarily use creature-based ramp. So we're running all of the mono-green mana dorks. Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, Fiendhorn Elves, Arbor Elf, and Boreal Druid are all here. Sakura Tribe Elder and Wood Elves are also here. These are creatures that get lands into play, so these are good in the deck too. Plaguemur is another great option in this deck. Not only is this a mana dork, but it also has Infect. So this might also help us with adding to our Infect totals. Now you may have noticed that there's a certain creature type that's really prevalent in this deck. Or maybe you haven't. Regardless, Elves are a pretty common creature type in this deck, and as a result, we do have sort of a hybrid Deathtouch Elf tribal thing going on here, which is pretty fun. Marwyn the Nurturer is a fantastic card in this deck. Whenever an elf enters the battlefield when Marwyn is out, she gets a +1/+1 counter. We can also tap her to add an amount of green equal to her power, so she has the ability to produce tons of mana for us. So do these next two cards. Elvish Archdruid is an anthem for our elves, but it can also tap for an amount of green mana equal to the number of elves we control. Priest of Titania has the same mana ability without the anthem effect. Bounty of Skemfar is a neat little card that's sort of like a Cultivate or Kodama's Reach. With this, we look at the top 6 cards of our library and put 1 land onto the battlefield tapped and 1 elf from among those 6 cards into our hand. Let's talk about some of those elves we have in our deck. Wren's Run Vanquisher is a 3/3 with Deathtouch that's only going to cost us 2 mana if we can reveal an elf from our hand when we cast it. Glistener Elf is a 1/1 with Infect, so this will help with giving out poison counters. Pollenbright Druid is another elf that lets us proliferate when it enters the battlefield. Next up, we have an elf that creates Deathtouch creatures. Wren's Run Packmaster is a 4-mana 5/5 that requires us to champion an elf when it enters the battlefield. But when we do, we have this creature that can create 2/2 wolves with Deathtouch for just 3 mana, which is incredibly useful for this deck. Yiva, Nature's Herald, is another great card in this deck. Being able to cast cards at instant speed is always great, but in this deck it's really neat because having Yiva out will allow us to cast our Deathtouch creatures at instant speed, meaning we can flash those creatures in front of anyone brave enough to attack us. We have even more elves in this deck, but they fall into other categories as well, so we'll touch on those when we get to them. Card draw is something that's going to be very important. With a deck that has such a low curve, we're going to be able to empty our hand really quickly, so we need to be able to refill it quickly. Beast Whisperer draws us a card whenever we cast a creature spell. Our deck is primarily creatures, so this is going to give us steady card draw. It's also worth pointing out that this is an elf. Lifecrafter's Bestiary also triggers whenever we cast a creature spell, but with this we have to pay 1 green each time to draw that card. Still, this is pretty nice, especially since it allows us to scry at our upkeep. Soul of the Harvest has a similar ability. With this creature out, we draw a card whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield. Since this deck is about dealing combat damage to our opponents, Keeper of Fables and Toski, Bearer of Secrets fit right in. Keeper of Fables will draw us a card whenever a non-human we control deals combat damage to a player. Most of the creatures in our deck, excluding our commander, are non-human creatures. Toski is a bit better because his trigger doesn't care about creature type. He's also indestructible and he can't be countered. And then we have a few card draw spells that care about the number of creatures we control. Since this deck has a lot of low-cost creatures, it shouldn't be hard to cast one of these cards for a high creature count. Collective Unconscious is a 6-mana sorcery that just says draw a card for each creature you control. Regal Force is almost the same thing, but on a 7-mana 5/5. I say almost the same thing because it only counts green creatures we control. Shamanic Revelation is a 5-mana sorcery that draws us a card for each creature we control and also gains us 4 life for each creature we control with power 4 or greater. Now this next card isn't solely card draw, but Vivien, Champion of the Wilds, is still a great card in the deck. First off, just having it out allows us to cast our creature spells at instant speed, which, as we already know, is a great ability to have with Deathtouch creatures. Her +1 gives a creature vigilance and reach until our next turn. This is nice because that creature can attack and stay untapped, meaning it will still be a threatening blocker. And it having reach means creatures with flying can't really attack us either. The -2 ability on Vivien is where the card draw comes in. With this, we look at the top 3 cards of our library and exile 1 face down. We can cast that card if it's a creature card at any time, and we can do it at instant speed because of Vivien's static ability. Return of the Wild Speaker is another card that can draw us cards. When we cast this, one of our options is to draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures we control. What's really great about this spell, though, is the fact that we can also cast it to give all non-human creatures we control +3/+3 until end of turn. If we have enough creatures out, or the right creatures out, this might even win us the game. Regardless, having that flexibility to do one or the other is really great. The final card under this category is Whisperwood Elemental. When this is out, at our end step, we manifest the top card of our library. So that card goes onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature. And then we can turn it face up for its mana cost at any time. So this is generating card advantage for us by putting creatures onto the battlefield. Another great thing about manifesting our cards is that we can swing in with them or block with them, and our opponents have no idea what's on the other side. By flipping them over at instant speed, we can surprise them with a Deathtouch creature or something else they aren't expecting. This also has great synergy with another Deathtouch creature we're running. We can return Deathmist Raptor from our graveyard to the battlefield when we flip over one of our manifestations, so this is a nice little interaction to utilize. Whisperwood Elemental has an activated ability as well. We can sacrifice it to give face-up non-token creatures we control an ability that says, when this creature dies, manifest the top card of your library. So we can activate this ability in response to a board wipe to get free creatures onto the battlefield after that board wipe resolves. Speaking of board wipes, well, we're not running any, but we are running spot removal. Acidic Slime is a classic. When it enters the battlefield, we can destroy an artifact, enchantment, or land. It's also a 2/2 creature with Deathtouch, so this fits right into our theme. Reclamation Sage is similar. This can target an artifact or enchantment to destroy when it enters. This is also an elf, so it fits in with that theme. Viridian Corruptor is also an elf, and this one destroys an artifact when it enters the battlefield. It's also a 2/2 with Infect, so it can dish out some poison counters. Fighting also happens to be a great mechanic when you're running a bunch of Deathtouch creatures. Ulvenwald Tracker has an activated ability where we can pay 2 mana and tap it to have one of our creatures fight another creature. As long as we have a creature with Deathtouch out, we should be able to kill just about any creature on the battlefield. With Halana Kessig Ranger, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, we can pay 2 generic mana, and when we do, that creature deals damage equal to its power to another creature. So if we're casting a Deathtouch creature, that creature is going to kill another creature if we pay the 2 mana. What's great about this is it's not technically fighting, so our creature isn't going to take any damage. Probably the best removal card in this deck, though, is Viridian Longbow. We can equip this card to one of our Deathtouch creatures, and it will essentially have a tap ability that says destroy target creature. Now, because our deck's main win condition revolves around poison counters, Proliferate happens to be a pretty good thing to run into from time to time. So we do have a few cards that can proliferate. So, in addition to Pollenbright Druid, which we mentioned earlier, we have a few other cards that can proliferate. Contagion Clasp is great in this deck. When it enters, we give a creature a -1/-1 counter. It also has an activated ability where we can pay 4 mana and tap it to proliferate. Being able to do this potentially every turn is very powerful if our opponents already have poison counters. And then there's Evolution Sage, which has a landfall trigger that lets us proliferate. Again, this is very powerful because it's going to trigger almost every turn. Extra poison counters is always a good thing. Well, at least for our opponents. There's a few other cards worth mentioning that are pretty essential but don't necessarily fall into a particular category. Swiftfoot Boots is one of those cards. Infect attracts a ton of spot removal, so it's good to have a way to protect against that. The most common target for equipping these boots is going to be our commander, but it can come in handy for giving a Deathtouch or Infect creature haste from time to time. We're not really running any tutors because we're building on a budget, aside from this next card. Wanvuli Beast Tracker is a 3-mana creature that allows us to search our library for a Deathtouch creature when it enters the battlefield, and then that card is put on top of our library. And then we have a few cards that are going to help us get our damage through. Predatory Focus is a 5-mana sorcery that says for this turn, our creatures deal combat damage as though they weren't blocked. This will ensure that our Deathtouchers will get through to deal out some poison counters and hopefully knock out one of our opponents. Champion of Lamholt is a great card for this. When this is out, it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever one of our creatures enters the battlefield. It also says that creatures with power less than or equal to its power can't block creatures we control. So we're going to beef this thing up by playing a bunch of creatures, and then all of our creatures will be unblockable. Bellowing Tangleworm is also a great budget option for ensuring our damage gets through. This is basically going to give all of our creatures Intimidate, so our opponents can only block our creatures if they have green creatures or artifact creatures. At the least, this is going to limit their options for blocking, but at its best, it's going to make our creatures unblockable. Unblockable is great, but another way to make things tough for our opponents is to make all of our creatures big. So that's what Scale Up is for. Most of our creatures are cheap and have relatively low power and toughness. Scale Up is going to turn a board full of small creatures into a board full of 6/4s if we cast it for its overload cost. This is another great way to knock out an opponent or two. Now before we close this deck tech out, we have a few utility lands to talk about. Colony Ambush is a modal double-face land card that can be used as a 3-mana fight spell, or enter the battlefield tapped as a land. Rogue's Passage is another way to get around pesky blockers to ensure one of our Deathtouch creatures can get through for some poison counters. Finally, there's Karn's Bastion. This land taps for a colorless mana, or we can pay 4 and tap it to proliferate. This is a great ability to have on a land. It's easy for our opponents to forget that it's there until it's too late. Just one activation could be enough to add that 10th poison counter to an opponent and finish them off. Now that we've covered the cards in the deck, let's talk about how much it costs. Using TCG Player, I was able to put this one together for $87.03. That's including heavily played cards and excluding basic lands. And no, I'm not sponsored by TCG Player, although I wish I was. But if you want to buy the deck, make sure to check out the link in the description below to check out the full list on Tapped Out. Well, that's it. If you liked the video, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any new deck techs. Also, if you can think of any good budget options I missed in this deck, let me know about it in the comments. Make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, thanks for getting your fix with me today. Stay safe out there. Peace out, guys.